Henry Martyn, missionary to Persia. We seek to find examples of excellence. So Henry Martyn was born in Truro, Cornwall, England. That's the far southwest of England. He was only 2 years old when his mother died from tuberculosis, TB. His sisters followed their mother to an early grave, and by the time he was 28, Henry Martyn was the only member of his family still surviving. I think again, just reminding us of how we take a lot of our medical advances and our health conditions today very much for granted. He was a gifted student, and the ease with which he is able to learn tempted him to avoid hard work, and he gained a reputation for idleness. And he was quite a reclusive student. He was not popular, and his small physique invited bullying by older boys. So to protect him from bullying, the teachers placed him under protection of another boy who had an enduring Christian influence on his life, which one must never underestimate the importance of mentorship. While studying at St. John's College and Cambridge University, Henry got into arguments and fights, and on one occasion he threw a knife at a fellow student, which was socially unacceptable back then and even more so today. At this time, his father died, and his sister began intensive intercession for her wayward brother. A lecturer and another student challenged Henry about his relationship with the Lord, and he began reading the Bible. As Henry was converted to Christ, he also achieved great success in his academic studies. But now, in the light of his conversion experience, Henry observed, "I obtained my highest wishes, but was surprised to find I'd grasped a shadow." His mind was now set, it had been set on being a lawyer, but now the testimony of William Carey, the missionary to India, and a book on David Brainerd, the great missionary to Indians, started to impact his life, and he began thinking about missions. So after graduating with high honors from Cambridge and ordained as a minister of the Church of England, he offered his services to the Church Missionary Society, the CMS, and he was appointed chaplain to British soldiers under the British East India Company, and Henry set sail for India. Now, he was an academic. He loved the seclusion of study, and it was a perpetual struggle for him to bring himself to confront people. He would have preferred to be engrossed in books and languages, so he is something of an academic evangelist. But as he sought to be faithful to his duty, a passion to win souls to Christ was fanned into flame, and Henry wrote, "Let me forget the world and be in a desire to glorify God." Another complication of his missionary work was his devotion to Lydia Grenfell. He feared that his passion for her was akin to idolatry. In fact, so much so, this story is in the book, Love Stories of Great Missionaries. Should he go to India with God or remain in England with Lydia? Did his calling require him to remain unmarried? He feared it did, and his friends advised him to set sail alone. It was with a heavy heart that he said goodbye to Lydia. They never saw one other again after he sailed, but her name appears on almost every page of his journal. Henry set out as a chaplain, meant to work amongst the British staff of the East India Company, and he is expressly forbidden to engage in missionary work amongst the Indians. He's being sent as a missionary to India, but not as a missionary to Indians. He was only to be a missionary to British soldiers and civil servants in the British East India Company in India. Well, when he set sail in August 1805, it was as part of a British fleet transporting 5,000 British troops to invade the Cape of Good Hope and seize it from the Dutch. And so en route to the Cape, Henry engaged in counseling soldiers and comforting victims of dysentery on the ship. And he saw the Cape captured in January 1806, which appears in his diaries, before continuing on his voyage to India. Many of the soldiers and sailors responded to his evangelistic efforts with indifference, opposition, and ridicule. He noted how the British defied the Dutch's plan, where they thought that they'd conveniently land on a beach immediately in front of the castle where they could get bombarded with cannon. Instead, they decided to land at Bloberg Strand, which is quite a distance from the castle, and they were able to set up their gun positions and camps and have tea before the Dutch and French soldiers rushed over and arrived exhausted in front of them, and they could fight them on their own ground. Just again, don't give away your advantage. If the British had been forced to try and seize the castle, they would have failed. The castle's never been taken in war. But they got the enemy to come to them and fight on their chosen terrain, and so often we do this too. We let the enemy trick us into coming onto their ground. And if the Dutch had just defended the castle, they would have had the advantage. He came away from the conflict for the Cape convinced that it was Britain's duty and destiny to evangelize the world, not to colonize it. He was not supportive of the seizure of the Cape by the British. He felt that was wrong. The Dutch were Protestants. We should have left them alone. I prayed that England, while she sent the thunder of her arms to distant regions of the world, might not remain proud and ungodly at home, but show herself great indeed by sending forth the ministers of her church to diffuse the gospel of peace. So he was obviously not popular with the soldiers and the civil servants when he expressed the idea that it would be better if Britain was sending missionaries overseas and not soldiers. Arriving in Calcutta in May 1806, Henry Martyn's first sermon at St. John's evoked great antagonism. Martyn's proclamation of basic reformed doctrines was viciously attacked even from that very pulpit by other ministers. The coarse sights and sounds of heathen outrages committed daily on the streets of India horrified Henry, who wrote, "If I had the language, I would preach to the multitudes all day, even if I lost my life for it." And so he did have an aim of open-air street preaching and did so through translators. And later, when he acquired the language, he was able to preach on his own. As Henry was assigned to different military bases to serve as a chaplain to the British troops, he also engaged himself in learning Hindustani and translating the Book of Acts and scripture tracts into the local language, which of course was illegal by British law at that time. His chaplaincy work at the local hospital was particularly effective, especially amongst the Hindu women. The Europeans were critical of Henry Martyn's ministry and thought it degrading that he should be troubled about the Indians. For their part, the Indians tended to hate him simply because he was an Englishman, so he knew what was to be rejected on all sides. If Henry had taken to heart the harsh opinions voiced concerning him, it is doubtful that he would have been able to achieve anything. It is very discouraging when you're being attacked by your own people and the people that you've been sent to. By 1807, Henry had established 5 schools for Indian children in and around Dinapore. He then translated the Book of Common Prayer into Urdu or Hindustani, and he concluded a commentary on the parables of Christ. Very effective way to reach unreached people is through the parables. Each Sunday, he conducted a service at 7 a.m. for the Europeans and at 2 p.m. for the Hindus. And believe it or not, people came, 7 a.m. even. Hospital visitation was a daily ministry, and one should never neglect ideas of hospital visitation. I think one of the worst things that's happened during this lockdown lunacy is forbidding people to visit in the hospitals and the prisons, because those are some of the most important areas of ministry for the church, and that even family can't visit their own relatives in hospital during the harsh parts of the lockdown is insane. But before the end of 1807, which saw so many great achievements in his ministry, 2 items of news from England plunged him into despair: the death of his elder sister and Lydia's refusal to his proposal of marriage. A year had passed since his letter proposing to Lydia had been mailed. It took a year for a boat to go all the way to England and to come back. So about 6 months one way, 6 months the other way. And so can you imagine that? He's waiting for a year for an answer, and the answer is negative. She's not going to travel out to India and marry him there. Henry poured himself into his ministry, and by March 1808 he had completed his translation of the New Testament into Urdu, Hindustani, which of course is completely illegal by Indian and British law, by Act of Parliament, and by the East India Company. So what he was doing was effectively underground work. By 1809, Henry Martyn was appointed chaplain at Cawnpore, a further 300 miles up the Ganges River. Here he had over 1,000 soldiers to minister to. He also began to preach the gospel in Hindustani publicly, open-air preaching in marketplaces. An influential sheikh who came to observe the strange sight was won over by the gospel. By 1810, he had established a congregation at Cawnpore. Henry suffered ill health, and he wrote that he found preaching physically demanding. Study was his delight, but public speaking was a burdensome duty. "It is the speaking that kills me," he wrote. And here we see a Sunday school teaching pamphlet giving some of the key parts of the life of Henry Martyn. The spirit of Christ is the spirit of missions. The nearer we get to Christ, the more intensely missionary we become. And that is so important. In our devotions, as we seek to get closer to Christ, we should be more concerned for his Great Commission. Henry Martyn completed the translation of the New Testament into Persian and determined to go to Persia to test and improve his translation. As he turned 30 years old, Henry Martyn sailed for Persia. Convinced that his Persian translation of the New Testament was of inferior quality, he set about completely revising his translation. Interacting with the Persians on the ground in Persia, he found that the Persian he had acquired in India was not good enough. He also involved in regular private and public arguments in challenging and refuting the claims of Islam. He succeeded in making the gospel a talking point amongst the highest authorities in Persia. By the time he had completed the Persian New Testament to his satisfaction, it was declared fit to be presented to the Shah himself. While attempting to gain an audience with the Shah at Tehran, Henry Martyn was challenged with an ultimatum to declare that Muhammad is the prophet of God. Well, Henry Martyn boldly refused and asserted instead that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And his opponents were enraged and they threatened to have his tongue torn out for blasphemy. There were fears that his precious book would be destroyed there and then. It was only by God's grace that he escaped with his life and his translation. He later completed the translation of the Psalms into Persian. When Henry was again struck by fever, the British ambassador Sir Gore Owsley and his wife nursed him back to health. Sir Gore himself presented the scripture to the Shah of Persia. The scripture was received with much gratitude and enthusiasm, because the Shah appreciated great learning and good literature. The Shah of Persia wrote, "In truth, through the learned and unremitted exertions of the Reverend Henry Martyn, it has been translated in a style most befitting sacred books. The whole of the New Testament is completed in a most excellent manner, a source of pleasure to our enlightened and august mind." Henry Martyn now intended to travel to Arabia to complete a Bible translation into Arabic. How bold and ambitious is that? However, his ill health as he contracted the plague forced him to return to England, and en route he had the joy of seeing Mount Ararat, where the whole church was once contained, safe in Christ, outride the storm of life and land at last on one of the everlasting hills. Shortly after that, in northeast Turkey, 16th of October 1812, the student they called the man who never lost an hour gained eternity. He had often been heard to cry, "Let me burn out for Christ." And this is in Cambridge University, this stained glass window, "Let me burn out for Christ." Revelation 15 verse 4. "Who shall not fear you, O God, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy, for all the nations shall come and worship before you, for your judgments have been manifested." And here you can see Henry Martyn as one of the figures depicted in the stained glass windows at Cambridge University. This is one of the chapters in the greatest century of missions book, Henry Martyn, Missionary to Persia and India. Any questions, comments on this character study? It's an example of excellence. Questions, comments? Can I ask, how many of you have heard of Henry Martyn before? Okay, good. Well, half. Unfortunately, he's not too well known by most people today, but he should be. And remember, Thursday night I was giving a presentation on Samuel Zwemmer and how Samuel Zwemmer used both Raymond Lull and Henry Martyn as two of the great examples that guided him in his ministry to Muslims. Any questions or comments?
How did he sort of overcome that academic evangelist sort of books to study to sort of get all of those other things? Because that seems to be...
It was obviously... It was not... It didn't come to him naturally. It's something that he had to force himself to do out of duty because of the commands of Scripture. And I think you can see this, for example, with John Calvin. John Calvin also was somebody who only wanted to be an academic student. He wanted to write books and study. He did not want to be a pastor, and he didn't want to be dragged into controversies. But William Farrell convinced him that it was his duty. And the fear of God fell upon him. So there are people who it's not necessarily in their natural bent and character, but they do it because they feel compelled. I myself would say that I'm a introverted, reclusive person by nature who would have been perfectly happy to spend his life with books and animals and not get involved in interacting with people at all. But my conversion call forced me out of my comfort zone. I think there are quite a few people who find themselves out of a sense of calling and duty, stretching themselves in what they don't necessarily feel very qualified to do. Yeah, no, Henry Martyn, I mean, it was brave, and you just think there was tremendous self-sacrifice because he really loved Lydia. I mean, that was clear. He never got over Lydia. And but even though she wouldn't join him in India, he stayed the course. Yes?
Are there any other missionaries today that have sacrificed as much as like missionaries we've just heard now? Just seems like a lot of them suffer a lot, like with health and losing families. You don't hear that really.
I don't think we get as dramatic examples as what we saw of the William Careys and David Livingstons, or Henry Martyns for that matter. No. But obviously there are sacrifices today. It's not as common because, first of all, transport is so much easier and medical care is so much more available and communication tools are so much more available. So, no, I don't know that we can compare the sacrifices we are making in the 21st century with the sacrifice they had to make in the 19th century. Just imagine waiting a year for a reply to a letter, which is common for them. Many of the missionaries had that. William Carey was in the field 14 months before he got his first letter from England, and it was criticism. Yes, you're going to say, Ryan.
When Henry Martyn left India for Persia, did he resign his position as chaplain in British East India?
Yes, no, he had to do that, indeed.
And so how was he supported in England? In Persia?
He was part of the Church Missionary Society.
So they said.
So the Church Missionary Society was still supporting him, yes. Now, the Church Missionary Society supported him first to be chaplain to India, to the East India Company, but they obviously supported his next phase. He did do things very much. He was a churchman. He worked through the church. And in the Church of England in the 19th century, the Church Missionary Society was the most evangelical group, as opposed to the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, which was more high church. So Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge would have been horrified at the idea of doing some illegal work in India. Church Missionary Society, they didn't mind. They were happy to turn a blind eye because they understood we must obey God rather than man. And CMS sent out some very fine missionaries. I can't think of too many examples of Society for the Propagation of Gospel of Christian Knowledge doing anything on the same level as CMS. But CMS even sent out missionaries like Dr. Kenneth Fraser, who established the work in Moorland, where our mission ended up establishing our base in Sudan. Fine people.
So you mentioned that Henry was not allowed to evangelize the Hindus and things, but when he started doing that, did he face opposition from his leaders?
Oh, he faced all kinds of opposition. Yes, enormous. And he was regularly being threatened by the British authorities and by the civil servants and so on. Of course, there was respect because he is a minister of the gospel. He is a minister of the Church Missionary Society because he is a chaplain. But he had relentless opposition. He was very unpopular with both the English people and with the Indians. But ultimately, he won through by just perseverance. Yes.
This matter has come up more than once, if I remember correctly. The idea that the British authorities sort of forbade these people from reaching out to the locals.
Yes.
Why would that be? Is it fear that sort of the situation might become unstable?
We know the reason. That the British Parliament was very clear that the relations with the local people in India, the British worked through indirect rule. So they were working through, while the British were ruling India through the Raj, but they were working through the local princes and leaders and sheikhs and emirs. And they did not want to upset them because the vast majority of the people in India were Hindu and the rest were Muslim. they didn't want to rock the boat and expressly didn't want anyone to offend the religious sensibilities or the cultures of India. And so it was said missionaries would only be permitted in the eastern dominions if the British East India Company gave them permission, which the British East India Company said they would not because it would be bad for business. They wanted nothing to upset their business dealings with India. And remember that India was originally a business prospect. It was there for the British East India Company. And the British Army was keeping things going to help the British businesses operate well. It was like many people think that Holland colonized the Cape. Actually, that's not true. Holland, it was the Dutch East India Company that ran the Cape. Yes, they had army and navy and so on, but it was the Dutch East India Company colonizing. It wasn't the Netherlands itself as such. It was nominally under the Netherlands, but was practically under the company, the VOC. And the same thing with the British East India Company. It was like today, if you can think of it, you may understand that the American soldiers are in different countries around the world, often helping American business interests who've got contracts and things going on in Iraq or Bahrain and so on. And so the army is there, and they're not actually represent the American people, even though the American government's there. They're not even representing American interests, but they are helping American business interests that are in that place with its oil companies and so on. You could argue even to the same sake that the Cuban soldiers that were now in Angola were there helping to protect the oil industry that was there being exploited for the benefit of Cuba. Gulf Chevron was using Cabinda in Angola, and a lot of the money was going to Cuba. And so the Cuban troops in Angola were there. They might not want to admit it. They'd say they were only there for ideological reasons, but they were actually there for clear financial benefits. And while they were communist, it was a capitalist benefit for Cuba as well. So just take the Royal Navy was used in the Opium Wars of the 1840s with China. China didn't want the British East India Company smuggling opium in because the people of China didn't want to trade with the West. And the West wanted to trade with China. China had a lot of things like silk and spices and all that they wanted, but they weren't interested in trading. And so the Rothschilds, who the bankers who controlled the British East India Company, were smuggling opium into China because they knew if you create a dependency, those addicts will want to trade anything to get their habit dealt with. And so they were growing the opium in India, they were smuggling it into China, and when China tried to stop them, the Royal Navy was deployed effectively as mercenaries for the Rothschilds to keep the Chinese people dependent and the channels open for smuggling opium into China. And so, shockingly, just like in Anglo-Boer War, the British Army and the entire Empire's armies from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were mobilized to fight in South Africa. For what purpose? Not for Britain, not for the British people, for the Rothschilds and their goal of gaining control of the gold mines on the reef. And so effectively they were mercenaries. And I'm afraid a lot of this has happened over the years where people think they might be in the army to serve their people. And they might think that they are serving the national interest, but actually they're serving some bankers' interests, some businessmen's interests. In the case of India, it was, again, the British East India Company, the Rothschilds exploiting the people. Later in India, it was for the silk trade and so on, and in South Africa, it was the gold. But sadly, the military and the Navy were there enforcing the wishes of the banksters, in this case, the Rothschilds. Very, it's quite ugly when you get to the facts of it. So that's why missionaries weren't allowed in India. They'd be bad for business. And so the communist propaganda that the missionaries were tools of the capitalists and the colonialists is such nonsense. Because, in fact, the missionaries were a pain in the neck to the governments. The colonial authorities loathed the missionaries. Because the missionaries were the conscience that come say, you can't do this and you shouldn't do this and what about that? And they'd be speaking up for the local people, and the colonial authorities tore their hair out, and they just want to get rid of these cursed missionaries, who were an absolute pain in the neck to them. Many of them were like John Phillips was one London missionary, Saudi missionary, based in the Cape, who caused no end of grief for the governors here as well, because, and that's why the modern narrative propaganda that the missionaries were somehow tools of the colonialists and so on is such nonsense. They were the very opposite. The colonials wanted to shut them up, to stop them, to co-opt them, to bribe them, threaten them, whatever they could do, but to stop them rocking the boat. And yet the missionaries were so successful that in the case of William Carey, forced the British in to stop widow burning of lepers, a burial alive of widows in some communities. And they start to inject a conscience into how they operated, thanks also to what William Wilberforce was doing. So the narrative of the Marxists that somehow the church is preparing the way for the colonial authorities is exactly false. It's the opposite. They were working against the policies of the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, the Rothschilds and so on.
Same was in the Congo. In the Congo, the missionaries also real claim to the Belgians.
Yes, right. Very good point. So the communists like to try and put the church in that category, but the church, the true church, has never been a tool of business and politics. They've always been a conscience against it. No, good point. So, any other comments or questions? Ryan.
During Martyn's time in Persia, was he primarily engaged in Bible translation, or did he also establish congregations and do evangelistic work in the streets?
He did evangelistic work for sure, but most of his evangelism was in homes, discussing these issues and debating them, and in so doing, he was helping to improve his translation by interacting and getting to understand the correct words and improving his Persian, that he was Farsi, that he was on top of the language so that he could produce a better New Testament. So definitely he was engaged in a lot of evangelistic conversations. He did some preaching, but not so much open-air preaching. It was more house meetings in Persia. In India, he found open-air meetings were the best. Persia, he was very focused on producing New Testament. But engaging and arguing and debating with the intelligentsia was essential to producing this superior production, which the Shah was even impressed with.
So about the translation, he did the Persian translation, his first translation. He took it to Persia and said it's not understandable to their language. So when he fled, did he make a new translation to be on the
Yes, no, that's correct. So he came to Persia with a translation that he'd worked on while he was in India. And he very soon realized in interacting with people that the Persian he had picked up in India was not of high enough standard. And that's why he revised the whole thing. Almost a new translation, but of course he had already studied, he knew the subjects, but now he realized that he was using perhaps a lower dialect. Just think, for example, if you are dealing with Australians and you're trying to produce a translation to English. Well, Australian English is not High English. Or you could be in Liberia, you could be speaking English there, but that's not necessarily high. You might be in Brazil learning Portuguese, but that may not be good enough Portuguese for Portugal, and it may not be exactly the same as the Portuguese that you use in Mozambique. So again, that's what he found. He found that while he understood the New Testament well enough, the words he'd used was inadequate. It was he was often using perhaps what could be slang or a lower version of the language. So Martin Luther, for example, translated German into Hochdeutsch, High German, as opposed to Plattdeutsch, which is what they sometimes refer to as Low German. And so even to this day, the Luther Bible is the highest standard of German, just like we'd say the King James translation of English is High English. And whereas these contemporary English versions and so on are extremely low standards, they use the same word for many things that don't have the same distinctiveness, and they're often using a word that's kind of a shadow of what the biblical meaning is trying to say.